Andy, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I really enjoyed this new book, and it's a lot of fun. Great title, and not only is the title fun, but the chapter titles are even more fun.
Well, thank you.
Now, I want to begin with a quote from chapter 1 where you talk about the current state of atheism. It's just a very quotable passage. So you say, much of contemporary atheism thrives on poor arguments and cheap sound bites, advancing claims that don't stand up to scrutiny. Like a cheaply made cardigan, they're full of loose threads that if tugged firmly begin to unravel. I wanted to quote that because I think that sets up well what you're doing in this book, is you want to begin to tug at some of these loose threads and show some of the problems with them. And in the first chapter, you begin with a bus sign.
The Atheist Bus, that's right.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this kicked off a few years ago in the UK. So Richard Dawkins and several other kind of high-profile atheists and atheist groups got together and sponsored a series of advertisements on the side of London buses. And the adverts ran like this. They said, "There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy your life." And so those buses were trundling around London, moved to Oxford, other European cities. So they've now made it over here in Canada. Right. So we had them in Toronto and so forth.
I think Calgary as well.
Calgary as well, yeah. So it's funny, I remember the first time a friend of mine actually rang me up and said, have you seen the Atheist Bus in London? It's quite funny, because I was like, well, how do you know if a bus believes in God or not? But it was these things. And it was interesting, huge amounts of media waves made. And I think what was interesting for me, Randal, about the Atheist Bus is it represented a facet of what's come to be termed the new atheism, and it's the media friendliness. I often meet atheist friends who are more reflective, who say they struggle with some of the simplicities of the new atheism. We actually have common ground there. But what I always say to them is, I say, you may not like them as representative of your position, but it is the public face now. This is very much the face of atheism that many people see, many Christians are feeling bearing down on them. So I think that was the sort of linchpin for me, the kind of epiphany that said, there's a movement here, there's a cultural phenomena that one needs to respond to, because that bus ad is clever, but it falls apart quite quickly when you tug on it.
Does it? Tell us more.
Tell us more. I was going to say, tell us more. Well, there's a couple of problems I have with the bus ad, and interestingly, in one sense, nothing. I always want to make a defense and say nothing I say in the book is in one sense original. What I'm doing is popularizing. So Julian Baggini, who is an atheist in the UK, was actually one of the first people to really publicly critique the Atheist Bus ad. So some of what I say are borrowed from him and from others. But the two major critiques I think you can make of the bus ad. Number one, what does it mean to say stop worrying? I mean, just a moment. So let's imagine that you've lost your job, your wife has walked out on you, taking the kids with her, or if they're teenagers, leaving the kids with you. You support, in Canadian terms, you support the Leafs. Life looks really, really bad, and here's Dawkins coming on going, "Hey, don't worry, there's no God." Well, actually, life can be pretty crappy, quite frankly. I don't see the connection between no God and stop worrying, unless you're an atheist who has spent nights lying awake going, well, I wonder, is there a God, is there not? And then the second problem for me is the even bigger one, the focus on enjoyment. Because the idea that the whole point of life is enjoyment, really ties into this whole sort of consumerist mentality I think we built up here in the West, that life is merely about having fun. And as one other writer put it, the only thing that's designed to be enjoyed and purely enjoyed are products, a candy bar or something. Your life is not a product. Life is about far much more than enjoyment. And so that bus ad is really, really focusing on this really narrow sliver of what it means to be human. So I think it fails on numerous grounds.
Well, what if someone says, I can imagine one target group for that bus sign are people who are worried about being in the wrong religion, who are worried about ending up eternally damned because they made the wrong choices in life. So maybe part of it is, hey, don't worry about the afterlife, don't worry about this eternal judge.
Yeah, I think so. And I think if I was going to be sympathetic, I think I would say that's probably the most positive target audience. I don't know how it plays out here in the Canadian scene. I've been here 6 years, still learning the culture. I think that's a fairly small demographic in the UK. And what's interesting is when I've seen Dawkins pushed on that bus ad, it sort of goes to pieces. There really wasn't any thinking behind it. In fact, I saw a recent interview with him where he said, well, actually, I was lobbying for a completely different slogan because I think it's come back and bitten him on the bottom. Yeah, I think definitely. I think if you're that kind of person who is sitting there really kind of worried about the existential questions, maybe it plays to you. But it does so in such a shallow way because I think there's if you are somebody who thinks there may be some kind of God, you're not sure which is the right religion, I think the best way forward is perhaps to actually go and do some investigation and pursue that question, not just allow sound bites to sort of be a salve so you can then move on, buy your iPhone, consume, and die.
Well said. So I can, well, I guess the thing is, if that is the target audience, or it charitably conceived as such, I suspect it's not really going to even have an impact for the person who really is torn up a bus sign. It's not going to make a difference.
No, and there's two thoughts there I think interest me. I mean, one is that the people that I run across on university campuses all the time, and in other settings actually, I run across an increasing number of people now who would self-describe as spiritual. They figured out there is some kind of higher power, there's something more to life than just the material. It's fascinating. We're finding now on university campuses, if you put on an event with a title like, Can Life Have Meaning Without God? I've just done that at the University of Alberta. I did a dialogue with a friend there who's an atheist, well actually, who now described himself as an agnostic philosophy prof. What was interesting is he walked in and then looked at the audience and turned to me and said, how come we've got almost 200 people here? We don't get that many for philosophy events. And I said, Don, because this title scratches where people itch. And all of the questions afterwards in the Q&A were in this kind of area. And I think for somebody like that, what they've figured out, there's some kind of spirituality to be explored, and they want help at navigating the terrain, not to just be sort of patted on the head and gone, don't worry about it. Because I think once you've worked out there's a spiritual dimension, then the question opens up, which religion? And I think that's a brilliant question, a hugely important question. But I agree with you. I don't think we go there just by going, hey, don't worry and move on. I think people are like, no, I've come from there. I've figured out there is something. What I now need help is navigating this space over here. That's the first issue. Second issue, I think one of the things driving the anger in some of the new atheism is that religion's not supposed to be here. You and I are not supposed to have been here. I think is it 50 years? It was 50 years today, a couple of days ago, since Time magazine published that famous cover, God is Dead, on the cover. I think it was, about 2 days ago. It was the anniversary of that. And of course, we look back now and smile at the how simplistic that was, because religion is not going away. Religion is growing everywhere. God is back with a vengeance, some might say. And so I think there's a need for people to understand religion purely sociologically and take it seriously, whether or not you agree with it. The majority of people in the world are members of some kind of faith community. The atheist community, in many ways, behaves like a faith community. So perhaps rather than flinging sound bites at each other, what we need is the opportunity to sit down around a table and say, okay, we need to start listening to each other, rather than flinging these rhetorical zingers at one another. Now that applies to Christians too. We are not immune from flinging sound bites at our atheist friends, thinking that if my atheist neighbour just sees that clever, bumper sticker I have of my Honda about Jesus, my work will be done.
Or how about April 1st is Atheist Day? Ha ha ha.
Oh, that's I hadn't seen that one.
No? Yeah.
That's special.
Yeah, that's very special.
Yeah, that's the kind of Christian equivalent of the Darwin fish.
Yes.
One of my neighbours used to have a little Darwin fish on the back of the.
Well, I think the Christian equivalent of the Darwin fish is the Christian ichthus fish eating
eating the Darwin fish. No,
yes.
that's exactly true.
One more thing about this Atheist Bus sign before we leave it behind. And this is a point that you make as well in the book, which is the kind of air of condescension.
Yes.
So it seems like one of the aspects of this new atheism is an aggressiveness and a sort of dismissiveness and condescension toward those of religious faith. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I think I say in the book that that bus ad was almost begging to be read in a slightly sort of Oxford accent, avuncular air of there's Dawkins saying, well, there, dear boy, don't worry. There's probably no God, in the same way that my grandmother would have gone, go on, eat up your sprouts. There's a good boy. And that condescension, I think, is fascinating. I think it actually damages the message. It was really interesting that I was teaching at a Christian college near here a few days ago, and one of the things I did for the students one morning is I had them watch the Dawkins-John Lennox debate in Oxford from about 4 or 5 years ago now. And then we did an exercise. I got them to respond on what they thought were Dawkins' best arguments and Lennox's best arguments. But I also got them to just sort of give me their initial impressions. And for many of them, this is the first time they'd been exposed to any of this kind of stuff. Almost the universal word used to describe Richard in that presentation was arrogant and cocky. And I found myself thinking, he does come over that way, and it damages the cause. In fact, on that very debate, it was interesting, one of the major British newspapers, I think it was the Times of London from memory, sent a journalist to cover the debate and to interview Richard Dawkins, interview John Lennox, and then do a feature piece. And I remember that article began by the journalist saying, he said, I'm an atheist. He said, so I went into this, rooting for Richard, he was going to be, because he's my team, effectively. But he said, what was interesting, before the debate, I had the opportunity to spend time with both men. And he said, John was incredibly lovely. He invited me and the team, my photographer, into his hotel room. He was making us tea. Nothing was too much trouble. Richard, he said, was brusque, a little bit rude. The photographer didn't do something in quite the way he wanted, so he really kind of laid into her. And he went on to say, that led to me actually, quite literally, going into the debate that evening, changing sides. I wanted John to win, not because I agreed with his position, I didn't, but because of the two people. He was the most engaging, personally. And I think it actually damages the message, which is a shame, because some of the richest conversations I've had with skeptical friends over the years have been those who are more ironic, more engaging. My friend at University of Alberta I mentioned earlier, we're now sort of pretty close friends. We disagree profoundly. We can have some incredible discussions, but it doesn't reduce to flinging sound bites across the table.
Now, Richard Dawkins obviously doesn't think Christianity or theism are intellectually respectable positions, and he's expressed a sort of incredulity about the fact that anybody could continue to maintain these beliefs in the 21st century. On the other hand, you point out, I think quite well in this book, some of the main weaknesses with this new atheism, that it's sort of atheism in the shallow end of the pool. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there is an intellectually serious atheism?
Very much so. Yeah. Very, very much so. Personally, one of my favourite philosophers for a long time has been Bertrand Russell. I think some of Russell's writings represent a depth there. Then, in the same sort of time window, you've got people like Camus and Sartre and those more existential end of atheism. And then writing today, I would count someone like John Gray from the London School of Economics, who's written very, very powerfully on atheism. His book Straw Dogs is a very powerful piece of literature. Julian Barnes would be another. Julian Baggini, we mentioned earlier, just a few names to throw at you. So the answer is yes, there is definitely a deep end of the pool. Now, what's interesting, when you go to that deep end of the pool, you actually tend to find that the respect for theism goes up because there is a recognition, there's a debate here. So another very well-known here in North America atheist is a gentleman called Michael Ruse. You're probably aware of Michael. Mm-hmm. Lovely man.
Actually, I debated him a couple months ago.
Oh, well, there you go. So I debated him last summer on a radio program in the UK, on the Unbelievable program, which I know you've been on as well. And I was really taken with something Michael said right at the start. He basically, we were talking about my book, and I sort of teased him and said I thought he'd probably agree with about 60% of it, and he said maybe more like 50%. He said, but what he and I agreed on was the shallow end of the pool, as you described it. And he said something that really struck me. He said, what I have to tell atheist friends time and time again, who are drawn to that more kind of newer atheism version of atheism, he said, I believe that Christianity is a very serious answer to a very serious question. Now, as an atheist, I think it's a wrong answer, but it's a very serious answer, and one that atheists need to take seriously. And I said, thank you, Michael. I respect you immensely for that. And also, I think it's important to say, Randal, I always stress this when I talk on the book, I am not saying all atheists are at the new atheist end of the spectrum. I'm at pains to say that. I say that in several points in the book. I'm not trying to say every atheist subscribes to this shallow end of the pool. There is a deep end of the pool as well. Right. But the shallow end of the pool tends to be the noisier end, which may be because when you go to a public swimming pool, who's down the shallow end? It tends to be the toddlers and the 3-year-olds. I have one, so that's always the noisy end, whereas the deep end of the pool tends to be more reflective.
Well, and we all, today in our culture, we're very much we tend to privilege the louder voices and the starker opinions.
We do.
Look at politics today. I mean, those are the people that get the attention. It's not the nuanced people who want to find common agreement between political parties and what we share and so on, and then have deep economic and political discussions. It's the people who speak in black and white.
Are you telling me you're not a Donald Trump supporter? I find that astonishing.
Now, why did you make that inference?
So, no, I agree with you.
I want to come to chapter 3. And all your chapters, as I said, have these really great titles. This one is titled The Aardvark in the Artichokes. And I'm not going to explain what that means. I think people need to read this book, and they need to read how you introduce and set up each one of these issues, these topics or arguments. And there's a great little story for that one. But there you say, why not all gods are the same? What are you responding to in that chapter?
So what I'm responding to in that chapter is one of the arguments that the new atheists have popularized. Again, to use Dawkins as the example, we're not using him as the whipping boy, but simply he's the one of the most common voices. One of the arguments he likes to run is he likes to say, well, he said, Christians are atheists with regard to, Zeus, Thor, Amun-Ra, Allah, he lists a whole series of other gods. He said, I just go one god more and add Yahweh to that list. So he's doing a couple of things there. He's trying to sort of suggest that the evidence for Christian theism, for the God of the Bible, is no better than that is for sort of, Thor or Mithras or any of these other gods of paganism. But he's also trying to sort of teasingly say, look, he's the consistent one, because he's a consistent atheist, whereas you and I are atheists with regard to everything apart from this one exception. So it's an attempt to really throw all religions into the same barrel and dismiss them all. So rhetorically, it's genius. It's very, very clever. I remember the first time I ran across it, a few years ago. I mean, it threw me slightly when I faced that in a Q&A, because I never really thought about framing the question that way. And now I hear it more and more commonly, and I have Christians saying to me, somebody asked me this question, how do I respond?
So you admit that you're an atheist about many gods?
I do, exactly. So in terms, but of course, therein is interesting. It shows a kind of sort of slippery term of the use of the term atheism, doesn't it? Because we can respond in a deeper way, and I do in the chapter. But I begin by saying I think it's a lazy use of language, because I'm a bachelor with regard to every woman other than Astrid, whom I've been married for 18 years. Does that make me a bachelor? Should I use that term? I don't think it's helpful. Dawkins has, as far as I know, one house. Maybe he's got a second one now in Oxford. But that means he's homeless with regard to every other house in the world. Does that mean he can sign on for government benefits? I just think this is a sloppy use of language, and that exposes it. It's a game. He's playing a game. But there's a serious point underneath it. And what I think is interesting about many of these sound bites is you can connect the soundbite version of the argument. You can trace it back and try and show how it opens up a broader issue. And it does open up the broader issue of, well, how do we determine between the different religions in the world? Because crazy soundbite arguments aside, there are lots of different religions. I mean, where I live in Toronto, you can choose from, Islamism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Jainism, secularism. You can even be a Leafs fan. We call that masochism. How do you navigate those different ideologies? Now, one answer has been historically, we just lump them all together and we recognize they're all paths up the same mountain, or we have to find some way of navigating between truth claims. And so, at the very least, the positive thing about Dawkins' little, aphorism there is it does open up that broader issue.
Now, the one thing that kind of bothers me about the way that atheists, some of the new atheists and others I've heard take that on is to try to say, well, you're being arbitrary because you've selected one god among other gods, or one religion among other religions. But isn't it more helpful just to embed this in a broader conversation of worldviews and say, well, the issue is we're all choosing one worldview over other worldviews?
Absolutely, and I think in the second chapter of the book, one of the things I do is I mount an argument. Scandinavian skeptic. Exactly, and of course you wrote a book with Sweden in the title as well, so that was parallel evolution. But one of the things I do in that chapter is I show that I think you can make a very powerful case that atheism is a worldview, is a belief system, because atheists will sometimes try and say atheism is just a non-belief; it's the absence of belief in God. But I think it's a considerable amount more than that. So so when you level the playing field and say everybody has a worldview, everybody has deeply held convictions, how have we selected that worldview? There are good ways and bad ways. Perhaps you've selected your worldview because you were raised that way. I think that's probably a bad way of choosing a worldview. Or we select our worldview because we've considered the evidence and come to the conclusion that it's true. And some of us have then done a compare and contrast on others. And so one of the things I find interesting when enthusiastic young skeptics run versions of this argument on me in public, I found it remarkably helpful to sort of say, well, which of the different worldviews other than atheism have you really properly studied? Usually, not always, but usually the answer is sort of begrudging none of them. And then I like to say, well, okay, I haven't studied all of them, and I don't think anybody can study all of them. There's thousands of other things. That doesn't mean we can't select. I have, on the other hand, taught philosophy and studied atheism to a considerable degree, and my PhD is in Islamic studies. So I've spent 20 years studying Islam. So I haven't just arbitrarily rejected Islam. I can give you very good, thought-through reasons why I am not a Muslim and why I'm not an atheist. There are good reasons why I'm a Christian. Comparison is the mother of clarity in some ways. And I think many of our atheist friends haven't necessarily stepped outside their own worldview, walked around it from the outside, and at least compared it to one other one seriously. That's one way of assessing truth claims.
I'm going to push back a little bit.
Push back. Go for it.
So it seemed that what you were saying is a person who starts off in a particular worldview and goes from there, rather than sort of stepping back and assessing the evidence for various worldviews, that they're somehow intellectually deficient?
Do you know, so at the moment I said that, I thought, oh gosh, I've opened myself up to something there. So I'm glad you've gone through that door. No, I don't think so. I think if let's start again. So if Christianity is true and describes the nature of reality, then of course you can have perfectly good grounds for being a Christian because of the nature of the Christian worldview. I do think you are at a slight disadvantage perhaps when you come up against somebody of another faith who has studied more widely, but not all of us are necessarily called to do that. I don't think that makes us epistemically deficient. I think it can put you at a slight disadvantage in a conversation. But depending on what you're going to do in your life and where God is calling you, that's not necessarily an issue. So I would say, for example, it's interesting in our marriage. My wife is a deep thinker, has a calling to sort of social justice issues and all kinds of things she's invested her life in. She would say that apologetics and philosophy doesn't especially interest her. Does that mean her faith is somehow deficient? No. I mean, she's got incredibly deep and thought through faith. Does it mean if she was to try and go on a stage and engage one of the new atheists who came out rhetorically slinging that she would find that harder? I think she'd be the first to probably say, yeah, which is why that's your job, not mine. So I think it depends on how you're engaging in the public square. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, that's fair. So chapter 4, you deal with psychological arguments. Of course, it's sort of de rigueur today for people to say, well, you're a Christian because wish fulfillment. You want there to be a God. You need psychological comfort. This is Linus's security blanket.
All that, yeah.
So how do you respond to those psychological objections, which, to my mind, they tend to function as what philosophers would call an undercutting defeater?
Yes.
Which means that it's trying to undermine your basis for being a theist because it's saying, well, your convictions are really generated by your psychological needs. How do you respond to those arguments?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it, Randall? And I think what I noticed was that, psychological arguments are kind of everywhere in our culture. I think that's the first thing. It's good to locate these in a setting. They're not just applied to the Christian faith now, are they? I mean, you can find people who can tell you that everything from the faith that you subscribe to, the person you marry, your political beliefs can all be explained, by your upbringing, by your relationship with your parents, by all kinds of sort of psychological things going on there. So there's a tendency, I think, in our culture to love psychological explanation. So it's good, it keeps psychologists in a job. I think the problem with psychological explanations of religion, particularly if you're going to try and weaponize them as if you're a skeptic, is one of the problems is, of course, they come back and bite you on the posterior because you can equally run them on an atheist. So, for example, if someone says to me, well, Andy, the reason you're a Christian is because your parents raised you in a Christian home and you loved your mum and dad and your upbringing. So Christianity makes you kind of feel warm and secure and it reminds you of your rosy-coloured childhood and all of these kind of things. Okay, fair enough. Maybe that's the case. Now, here's the problem. What happens if you're an atheist and it turns out you were raised in an atheist home? Same argument applies. The reason you're an atheist, the reason you're a skeptic is your mummy and daddy raised you in atheism. They took you off to local secular society where lovely skeptical old ladies made you chocolate brownies and patted you on the head, and so it gives you the warm. You see, all you've done is reverse it, so it cuts off the branch that you're sitting on. So I think that's one problem. Secondly, it skirts a hugely important question. For me, the most important question, Randall, is not so much why somebody believes something. That's interesting, but I guess maybe it's my philosophical roots coming through. My concern is why is something true? There's all kinds of things that that give us psychological comfort or things that disturb us, but just because we find something comfortable or something disturbing doesn't tell us whether it's true. I mean, as I sort of quip in the book, I mean, lots of things give me the warm fuzzies. I like the idea of mountain walks. I like the idea of chocolate. I like the idea of sex. I like the idea of miniature roller skating elephants. That idea makes me smile and so forth.
Never thought about that one before.
There you go.
I can see where
it's
you're
a lovely
coming
idea. The problem is that just because I have a warm feeling about those ideas doesn't tell you which of the three actually exist and which one doesn't. All you can do is talk about me. It interiorizes everything. And I've begun to wonder, actually, I don't go into this in the book, I'm now kind of thinking some of this through out loud. I wonder if that argument is indicative of the whole kind of postmodern turn, really, from the objective to the subjective. We've moved in things like sort of art criticism and literature and the humanities from talking about, the meaning in the text to the subjective meaning that the reader finds there. When we see a piece of art or a beautiful object, there's a tendency to sort of use words like, I find that pretty. And as C.S. Lewis once kind of remarked in The Abolition of Man, the problem is that kind of language tells you about me, doesn't tell you about it. We've internalized. And I think there's something lying behind that, probably in this whole psychological approach to religion. I want to get it back to the core question. Is it true? If atheism is true, then we should be atheists. If Christianity is true, we should be Christians, even if it makes us feel terrible, which interestingly enough, Christianity often does. I think my atheist friends often think that Christianity is just about feeling comfortable. I often like to draw them to passages like, Luke chapter 9, take up your cross and follow me. If Jesus was going for the comfortable route, he needed a better social marketing guru among the disciples, because that's not really a seller.
Yes, Christianity isn't the kind of thing you'd necessarily invent if you just wanted to comfort yourself and feel good. You also have this prospect of judgment, potentially of hell. So this is not just a warm, fuzzy God who's just going to give everybody a bear hug no matter what they do. There are aspects of this worldview that suggest it would not be generated by the projection that the critics assume.
I think so. I've often sort of sat back and reflected on that. If I was inventing a religion from whole cloth, there are all kinds of things I think I would probably have come up with that aren't there in Christianity. As you say, a God whose job is to sort of sit there and pat us on the head and say, well done, you're wonderful, all of your choices are excellent. A God who would affirm every one of my prejudices, political and moral. And ideally, a low-entry condition heaven. The condition just low enough that I could make it in, but just high enough that those people over there that the ones, the slightly funny-looking ones, don't make it. Full of people like me, very British. That's what I'd come up with. Instead, what do we find? Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. He demands your entire allegiance. There's the heaven and hell issue. There's all kinds of ways that Christianity cuts against my natural
inclination.
inclination.
There's all this stuff about selling all you have and giving it to the poor, and I'm just wrestling with that one.
And then also, I look around the world today, and I say one of the privileges of working in the job that I do is I get to travel a lot, and I get to meet people from incredible backgrounds. And every time I travel to places like the Middle East and meet Christians who have, grown up perhaps in Muslim countries where it's difficult to be a Christian. I mean, back in November, I was out in Asia, in places like Indonesia and Malaysia and some of those countries where, okay, it's not as tough as others, but it's still tough being a Christian. And I was incredibly impressed with the Christians I met there and what it's cost them. That cuts both against this. It's also a sobering reminder to me as a Western Christian, sometimes how easy it is being a Christian here. And one of the things I constantly ask myself is not so much, am I psychologically deceived, but do I really, really believe this? Because it doesn't really cost me. Is that cross that I'm carrying, padded with nice kind of soft corners versus the cross that my brothers and sisters in the Middle East are carrying? If religion's just about psychology, then every Christian in the Middle East should become a Muslim tomorrow. Life become incredibly easy, or become a communist in China. Life will be easy. But they don't. They carry on at a huge personal expense, which tells me psychology is precisely the wrong place to be looking for the explanation.
We've just scratched the surface here. I think we're going to have to kind of draw it to a close. I would encourage people to get the book, 11 packed chapters with humor and analysis. But I just want to come to a question that takes us a little bit beyond that, and that's, in this book you've devoted a lot of time to clearing away bad arguments for atheism, apologetic atheism. I assume that you also would agree there are some bad arguments for Christian theism out there in the apologetic pop sphere. And do you have anything to say about any arguments that you hear from Christians that you think are worthy of critique that are not particularly strong?
Yeah, I think there are a number. It's tempting to sort of list a few. On the other hand, attempt to be a gentleman to our own side. But I think, for example,
you don't have to name names.
No names. So, for example, sometimes, and I can see the email screens lighting up immediately, and the angry emails coming in, but they'll come to you, not to me. I think sometimes, not all, but some of the arguments that have sometimes been used from design, we need to be careful around. There's the notorious, design argument from the banana that a certain apologist who I won't mention was fond of using a few years ago, which was rightly mocked by atheists. I think, but there's actually a more general class of approach that we sometimes use as Christians that maybe I'll go for here. I think one of the things that sometimes happens, I caught myself doing it years ago, and it was only when it was pointed out to me by older, wiser heads that I rethought it. And it goes like this: someone comes to you and says to you, perhaps they're not a hostile skeptic, but a non-Christian says to you, Randal, why are you a Christian? Andy, why are you a Christian? And I say, that's a great question. Maybe it's a friend or a neighbour. And I say, well, the reason I'm a Christian, I guess, is I met a friend at work about 15 years ago, and works in the cubicle next to me. We became quite good friends. We started playing soccer together. And turns out he went to church, and he invited me along to his church, actually. I went to this, there was this thing called Alpha. Went along to it. It was lovely. There was lovely food. People were very friendly. They had a couple of questions. They answered them, and it was wonderful. And so I became a Christian. Now, here's the issue. What I've done, I've given my testimony, basically. But the problem is, my friend has asked me a why question. Why are you a Christian? And I've responded with a how-shaped answer. Problem is, we could rerun the script. I met a friend at work about 15 years. I met a guy at work about 15 years ago. We worked in the cubicles next door. We became friends. We played soccer together. Turns out he was a Buddhist. He invited me along to a little course at his Buddhist temple. It was great. The food was lovely. The people were very friendly. And so I became a Buddhist. And if the answer to the question, why are you a Christian today, is the story of how you became one, we have a problem. Because I think the question that our friends and our neighbours and our colleagues and our classmates are interested in is, why are you a Christian now? I mean, what reason? What are the reasons why today? Okay, why you became one is an interesting piece of autobiography, but why today, given the challenges that life throws up? And 1 Peter 3:15 commends us to give an answer for the hope that we have. And I just think the more general problem as Christians we have is a tendency to slip very quickly into narrative testimony. There's nothing wrong with personal testimony, but everyone has a story. One of the things the postmodern world has taught us, we all have stories. And people also need to know reasons why our story is compelling. And so I think that's why apologetics, on some level, should be for everybody. Every one of us needs to be able to give that reason why we hold these things are true. Some of us are called to give it at a highly philosophical level. Others of us are just called to give it at a level that our friends and the neighbours can understand.
Well said. Thanks a lot for having this conversation, Andy.
Thanks, Randall. It's been a pleasure.
Great.